Find Mercer. Whatever you do, do not let the human leave this station. Curator Tovin Krell heard his own voice crack across the emergency channel and hated that everyone could hear the fear in it. Around him, the Grand Exchange Station was still functioning, but its sensor systems had begun contradicting one another. Docking computers reported clear lanes where navigation arrays detected obstructions. Environmental monitors disagreed about pressure readings. Automated diagnostics insisted every individual system was operating within acceptable limits. And in the middle of the confusion stood the aliens Tovin had personally certified as defective only hours earlier, reacting to errors before the station computers could even identify them. "Why do we need Mercer?" an officer demanded. Tovin stared through the observation window at Lyra Vale and the others. "Because he was the only person here who understood what we sold him." 6 hours earlier, Tovin would have considered those words professionally humiliating. At Auction Hall 7, he had considered Ethan Mercer professionally amusing. The human sat alone near the rear bidding platform, a 38-year-old white man from Earth wearing a plain charcoal jacket, while buyers from 31 systems competed for rare technology, shipping contracts, and legal service bonds. Then Lot 17 appeared. The room went quiet for an entirely different reason. 12 Veyari entered the evaluation area under supervised transfer protocol. Their blue-gray skin reflected the white auction lights, and every one of them carried the same red classification marker on their records. Defective. Tovin addressed the bidders. All 12 demonstrate documented sensory irregularities, delayed environmental responses, and substandard performance under standardized coordination testing. Transfer terms reflect their reduced commercial placement value. No hands rose. Tovin lowered the opening price. Nothing. He lowered it again. Someone near the front laughed. Lyra stood at the center of the Veyari group, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the floor. Tovin had seen that expression before. Pride trying to survive paperwork. "Final call," he announced. "Any registered bidder?" A human voice answered from the back. "All 12. The room turned toward Ethan. Tovin blinked. "You wish to bid on the entire lot?" "Correct. You understand the classification?" "I can read." A few bidders laughed. Tovin displayed the combined price. Ethan authorized it without hesitation. That created louder laughter. A merchant beside him leaned over. "Human, you could buy 3 certified specialist contracts for that." Ethan glanced at the Veyari. "I am not shopping for specialists." Tovin completed the transfer and approached him afterward. "Mr. Mercer, professional courtesy suggests I remind you that auction purchases are final after biometric confirmation." "Good. You seem unusually comfortable with the risk." Ethan held out his hand for the evaluation files. Tovin transferred them. The human read the first report, then the second, then the third. His expression changed slightly. Not disappointment. Interest. He opened all 12 records side by side. "Who certified them as defective?" Tovin straightened. "I did." Ethan looked up. "Personally, my department designed the testing protocol." Ethan returned his attention to the files. "Same lighting. Standardized. Same atmospheric pressure?" "Of course." "Tested individually?" Tovin frowned. "Isolation prevents contamination between results." Ethan nodded once. "That explains it." Lyra finally looked directly at him. Tovin felt irritation rise. "Explains what?" Ethan closed the files. "Why nobody in this room knows what they were looking at." The laughter stopped. Tovin stared at the human. Ethan simply authorized the final transfer, turned toward the 12 supposedly defective Veyari, and said, "Come on. First thing we are changing is the light. You paid enough for us to be valuable, human, so tell me what you expect in return." Lyra Vale waited until the auction hall doors closed behind them before confronting Ethan Mercer. The other 11 Veyari stopped with her in the transfer corridor, their blue-gray faces carrying the same guarded expression. Ethan looked at Lyra, then at the red classification marker still glowing beside her identification. "Record. Right now? About 10 minutes of patience." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "We are not a human experiment." "Good. I am not running one." Tovin Krell followed them from the hall, partly because station procedure required supervision and partly because Ethan's confidence had become irritating. "Mr. Mercer, your assigned habitat is this way. Not the standard habitat." Tovin stopped. "You purchased Veyari contracts. The station provides species-approved accommodations. Approved by the same department that tested them." Tovin's expression hardened. Our standards are recognized across 14 systems. Ethan nodded. That was not an answer. Lyra watched the exchange carefully. She clearly did not trust Ethan, but Tovin noticed something worse. She was listening to him. Ethan requested a private habitat bay nearly 300 feet across, large enough for the entire group to remain together. Then he asked for manual environmental controls. Tovin checked the request twice. That upgrade costs additional credits. Charge me. You have already spent an unreasonable amount. You keep saying that like it is your money. Tovin approved the request with visible reluctance. As they walked, several auction buyers passed them. One recognized Ethan and smiled. Still happy with your bargain, human? Ethan kept moving. Very. Give it a day. Lyra looked away. Ethan did not. Interesting, he said quietly. What? Lyra asked. They keep laughing before checking whether they are right. Inside the habitat, Ethan opened the 12 evaluation records again. Lyra stepped closer. You studied those files before purchasing us. Yes. Then you knew our classifications. I knew what the reports called you. There is a difference. Ethan enlarged the performance graphs. Apparently, Tovin folded his arms. The evidence is straightforward. Every subject showed delayed responses during isolated sensory testing. Ethan placed the graphs together. Not delayed randomly. Tovin frowned. Ethan aligned 12 timelines. The failures occurred in nearly identical sequences. Different individuals. Different testing sessions. Same pattern. Coincidence, Tovin said. Ethan looked at him. 12 times. Shared biological limitations. Then why does the limitation begin at almost exactly the same environmental transition? Tovin opened his mouth, then stopped. Lyra moved closer to the display. What transition? Ethan highlighted the test conditions. Your evaluations changed light frequency 43 seconds before performance declined. Lyra stared at the numbers. We were told the light was irrelevant. I noticed. Tovin shook his head. Standard illumination cannot explain neurological deficiency. Ethan walked to the habitat controls. Then this should prove you right. He lowered the harsh white illumination and shifted the spectrum toward the softer violet range listed in old Veyari environmental records. Lyra inhaled sharply. The other Veyari raised their heads almost together. Ethan noticed. So did Tovin. What did you do? Lyra whispered. Changed one variable. Ethan adjusted atmospheric pressure slightly, keeping every setting within safe Veyari limits. Then he disabled the internal partitions so all 12 occupied the same shared space. Tovin stepped forward. Your purchase agreement does not authorize unsupervised biological testing. Ethan turned toward him. Good thing nobody is being tested. Then what are you doing? Ethan looked at Lyra and the 11 Veyari, now standing closer together without anyone instructing them to move. Their breathing had begun settling into an eerily similar rhythm. I am correcting your test conditions. Tovin started to object, but Lyra suddenly turned toward the far wall. Something is wrong. Tovin followed her gaze. Nothing appeared unusual. With what? She pointed toward an environmental sensor almost 60 feet away. That unit. Tovin checked his station interface. Every diagnostic indicator showed green. It is functioning normally. Ethan did not look at the interface. He looked at Lyra. How do you know? Lyra stared at the sensor as if the answer frightened her more than the question. I do not know. 3 seconds later, the station console issued a maintenance alert. The wall sensor had drifted outside calibration tolerance. Tovin stopped breathing for a moment. Ethan merely looked at the remaining 11 Veyari. Every one of them was already staring at the same sensor. Do not congratulate yourself yet, Lyra Vale said, because the human silence was beginning to bother her more than Tovin Krell's disbelief. Ethan Mercer stood beneath the softer violet light while the maintenance alert confirmed what 12 supposedly defective Veyari had sensed seconds before the station itself. Tovin immediately opened the sensor history. Calibration drift happens. Ethan nodded. Of course. One correct observation proves nothing. Also true. Tovin stared at him, visibly irritated by the absence of an argument. Then stop looking at me like that. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I am waiting for you to finish proving my point. Lyra almost smiled, then caught herself. She turned toward Ethan instead. You expected this. I expected something. That is not an answer. It is the accurate one. He returned to the evaluation records and separated the environmental data from the performance scores. Lyra followed. She had spent years being told what those scores meant. Slow response, poor sensory integration, unreliable coordination, defective. The word had followed her from medical offices to employment reviews and finally into the auction registry. Ethan seemed strangely uninterested in it. Why us? She asked. Ethan looked at the 12 records. Because 12 people do not usually fail in exactly the same way unless something else is failing first. Tovin stepped closer. You are assuming the tests were flawed. No. I am asking why your tests demanded isolation from a species whose oldest habitat records describe communal sensory behavior. The room became quiet. Lyra looked at him sharply. What records? Ethan opened an archival file dated nearly 4 centuries earlier. Your homeworld studies. Tovin scoffed. Historical observations are not modern clinical evidence. Maybe not. But they mention Veyari settlements using shared low-frequency environmental cues for navigation before modern sensor systems became universal. Lyra stared at the display. She had heard childhood stories about ancestors who could sense storms before. Instruments detected them. Everyone treated those stories as folklore. Ethan continued. Then standardized testing arrived. Bright neutral lighting. Individual chambers. Artificial atmospheric stability. Every condition designed to remove outside influence. Tovin nodded. That is how accurate testing works. For individuals. Ethan looked around the room. What if you were measuring a network one disconnected piece at a time? Tovin's expression changed for half a second. It was enough. Lyra noticed. You never tested groups, she said. Isolation prevents subjects from influencing one another. Maybe influencing one another was the point. Tovin looked toward the 11 Veyari. That is speculation. Ethan nodded toward the habitat controls. Then we do not speculate. He asked the station computer for permission to run a harmless environmental comparison using normal habitat settings. Tovin approved reluctantly, perhaps because refusing would look worse. Ethan restored the brighter auction standard light. Within seconds, Lyra felt the strange awareness fade. The room seemed flatter somehow. Quieter. Ethan returned the violet spectrum. The sensation came back. Not a voice. Not a thought. More like noticing that 11 other people were noticing with her. One Veyari turned toward the ventilation system. Another looked toward the floor. Lyra felt a faint, irregular rhythm through the soles of her feet. The circulation fan near the east wall is unbalanced, she said. Tovin checked the diagnostics. Green. He folded his arms. Nothing. Ethan waited. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. At 32 seconds, a maintenance advisory appeared. Minor rotational variance detected in the east circulation unit. Tovin's arms slowly dropped. Lyra looked around at her people. Nobody appeared weak now. Nobody looked confused. For the first time in years, she did not feel like part of herself was missing. Ethan closed the testing files. Mr. Krell, I think your classification requires review. Tovin's face tightened. 2 maintenance predictions do not erase years of certified evaluations. No, Ethan said. But they should make you curious. Tovin turned toward the door. I will request an independent assessment. Good. He stopped when Ethan added. Make sure they test all 12 together. Tovin left without answering. Lyra waited until the door closed. You embarrassed him. Ethan shook his head. His data embarrassed him. And what happens when everyone else realizes you were right? Ethan looked toward the auction contract still displayed on the wall. That is when this gets complicated. Lyra followed his gaze. Why? Ethan enlarged a clause concerning classification errors and ownership review. His expression lost the faint amusement it had carried all afternoon. Because the moment they stop believing you are defective, they are going to want you back. They are not getting us back. Lyra Vale said it before Ethan Mercer finished reading the classification review clause. And for the first time since leaving the auction floor, all 11 Veyari answered her without speaking. They simply moved closer. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. I was hoping you would say that. Lyra studied him. Why? Because I need to know what you want before everyone else starts deciding it for you. She glanced toward the contract display. You already decided once. You bought us. Ethan reached into his jacket, removed his authorization card, and placed it against the wall terminal. Then we should fix that misunderstanding first. The transfer record opened. Lyra expected ownership terms, work requirements, or repayment conditions. Instead, Ethan selected the section governing Terran legal recognition and submitted 12 requests for independent status review. What are those? She asked. A way to make sure nobody mistakes a purchase receipt for permission to control your lives. Lyra stared at him. Then why purchase us at all? Because the auction would not release you without a buyer. So what do you expect from us? Ethan looked directly at her. Nothing you do not choose. Before Lyra could answer, the habitat door signaled an incoming official request. Tovin Krell entered with 2 independent technicians and considerably less confidence than he had carried earlier. The review board authorized a controlled assessment. Ethan stepped aside. Together? Tovin hesitated. Together. The technicians installed passive monitoring equipment while the Veyari remained inside the shared habitat. No isolation chambers appeared. No harsh white illumination returned. Tovin instructed the system to introduce minor, safe environmental variations within approved limits. The first adjustment was almost imperceptible. Lyra felt it anyway. A faint pressure change moved across the room. Before the monitors displayed anything, 3 Veyari turned toward the western ventilation grid. Another variation followed. This time, 6 reacted. Ethan said nothing. Tovin watched the data. Again, the technicians changed a different parameter. Lyra felt a subtle vibration beneath her feet, then something stranger. She knew one of the others had noticed it before she saw him move. Her attention shifted toward the northern wall at exactly the same moment as the rest of the group. 12 faces turned together. One technician froze. That response time is impossible. Tovin leaned toward the display. Check synchronization. Already checking. The technician looked up. Their collective response precedes the station monitor by nearly 4 seconds. Tovin shook his head. Run it again. They did. 5 seconds. Again. 4.7. Again. Nearly 6. Nobody laughed now. Lyra felt the awareness growing stronger as the group relaxed. It was not telepathy. She could not hear thoughts or see through another person's eyes. It felt more primitive and more useful than that, like 12 separate senses feeding one shared instinct about the space around them. Tovin slowly approached Ethan. How did you know? I did not. Do not insult me. I suspected your testing environment was suppressing something. That is different. Tovin looked at Lyra. This capability does not appear in modern Veyari medical records. Ethan answered before she could. Because modern Veyari testing isolates subjects. Tovin went silent. The lead technician requested one final comparison. He reduced the violet illumination toward the standardized white spectrum. Lyra felt the connection weaken almost immediately. Then he restored the habitat. Conditions. Awareness returned. The technician stared at the results. Curator, the classification is indefensible. Tovin's face became still. Do not transmit that conclusion yet. Lyra stepped forward. Why not? Tovin looked toward the habitat door. Because this station has buyers who paid fortunes for sensory technology that cannot do what you just did naturally. Ethan's expression hardened. And now they are going to hear about it. Tovin did not answer. He did not need to. His communication terminal was already filling with priority requests. One message became 10. 10 became 30. Offers appeared. Private meetings. Research contracts. Acquisition proposals. The same organizations that had ignored Lot 17 were suddenly competing for access. Lyra watched the numbers climb and felt something colder than satisfaction. Yesterday, we were defective. Ethan looked at the incoming offers. Apparently today you are expensive. Tovin turned toward him. Mercer, you need to understand what happens next. Ethan closed every offer without opening one. I do. The Consortium can challenge the original transaction. I know. They have attorneys across 20 systems. Ethan gave him a faint smile. So does Earth. Tovin stared at him. You expected this. Ethan looked toward Lyra, then toward the 12 independent status requests quietly processing beneath the auction contract. I expected people to become interested the moment they realized they were wrong. Lyra crossed her arms. And what did you prepare for? Ethan watched another acquisition offer appear, then deleted it. The part where they decide being wrong gives them the right to take you back. Defective was never a medical conclusion, Ethan Mercer said. It was the name your system gave them when they failed to behave the way your system expected. Tovin Krell stood across the habitat control table while 3 Consortium representatives appeared on the communication display. Lyra Vale and the other Veyari remained together beneath the violet light. watching the officials who had suddenly discovered professional interest in people they had ignored less than a day earlier. Your interpretation is irrelevant, said Administrator Veyari, the senior representative. The original classification is under review. Until that review concludes, the Consortium may temporarily suspend transfer rights. Ethan nodded. You can review your classification. Then you understand our position. No, I understand your mistake. Corinne's expression tightened. Explain. Ethan opened the independent assessment results. Your tests measured 12 Veyari as isolated individuals. Their response scores declined under the same environmental conditions because isolation and standardized illumination disrupted a biological function your protocol never attempted to measure. Tovin looked toward Lyra. The evidence had become difficult to deny. Under shared conditions, the 12 did not merely perform better. Their awareness changed according to proximity, environmental rhythm, and light spectrum. Separate them, and the effect weakened. Restore the group, and it returned. Lyra stepped toward the table. All my life, doctors told me I processed environmental changes too slowly. Tovin lowered his eyes. That is what the data showed. Your data showed what happened after you separated me from everyone else. Ethan glanced at her, but he did not interrupt. Lyra continued. You called the result defective because you never questioned the test. Corinne shifted impatiently. This discussion can continue after the subjects are returned to Consortium supervision. Ethan's expression changed. Subjects. That is the legal terminology. Not under Terran recognition. Corinne looked almost amused. This is not Terran territory. No. But you accepted Terran commercial law when you approved my bidder credentials and processed the transaction through an Earth-backed account. Tovin turned toward Ethan. You selected that payment route deliberately. I select most things deliberately. Lyra stared at him. Another piece of the human's behavior suddenly made sense. Ethan had not simply noticed the testing problem. He had prepared for the moment somebody noticed his discovery. Corinne opened the auction agreement. The Consortium retains review authority over misclassified assets. Ethan tapped the table. Read the next clause. Silence lasted several seconds. Corinne's expression hardened. That clause concerns sapient autonomy disputes. Correct. It has never been applied to this category. Then today sounds educational. Tovin nearly laughed, but the incoming alert stopped him. Another buyer had submitted an offer. Then another. The numbers climbed beyond anything paid at the original auction. Lyra looked at the display with open disgust. They did not want us when they thought we were broken. Now they think you are technology. Ethan said. That is not better. Tovin looked at the assessment data again. Mercer, there is something else. He enlarged the synchronized response chart. The Veyari are not sharing identical sensory information. Each individual appears to contribute a different fragment. Ethan leaned closer. Meaning? Tovin swallowed his pride. Meaning we misunderstood the mechanism too. This is not 12 copies of the same ability. It may be 12 partial perspectives becoming more accurate together. Lyra looked around at her people. Suddenly the old Veyari stories made sense. Villages sensing storms. Travelers finding routes through darkness. Communities detecting changes no individual could explain. Their ancestors had not possessed a mysterious gift that modern Veyari somehow lost. Modern life had separated, standardized, and measured them until the ability became invisible. We were never defective, Lyra whispered. Ethan shook his head. No. Tovin stared at the red classification still attached to her record, then reached for his curator authorization. One by one, he suspended all 12 defect labels pending correction. Across the display, Corinne rose from his seat. Curator, you were not authorized to do that. Tovin looked at the human, then at Lyra. Hours earlier, he had been certain Ethan Mercer was the most foolish bidder in the station. Now he understood something much more uncomfortable. I was authorized to place those labels, Tovin said. I can admit when the evidence says I was wrong. Corinne terminated the channel. Almost immediately, a priority consortium notice appeared across the habitat terminal. Access restriction pending ownership review. Lyra looked toward Ethan. Is that bad? Ethan read the notice once. It means they have stopped pretending this is about science. What is it about now? Ethan looked at the rapidly increasing offers for 12 Veyari the galaxy had called worthless that morning. Control. You cannot sell people twice just because the second price is better. Ethan Mercer said it quietly, but Administrator Val-Corinne heard every word. The Consortium representative had returned to the communication display with 3 legal officers and an offer large enough to make Tovin Krell stare at the number twice. Corinne folded his hands. This is not a second sale. It is a corrective acquisition following classification error. That sounds expensive in attorney language. Mr. Mercer, the Consortium will refund your original payment at 4 times its value. Ethan shook his head. No, 10 times. Still no. You are refusing an extraordinary profit. I am refusing your assumption that the decision belongs to me. Lyra Vale stepped beside him. Then ask us. Corinne barely looked at her. The review concerns contractual control. Ethan's expression cooled. She just gave you the answer. Tovin watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Only hours earlier, he would have spoken exactly as Corinne did. Now every reference to control sounded different. Lyra crossed her arms. We are not returning. Corinne addressed Ethan again. You are encouraging noncompliance. No. I am listening. The Consortium can freeze your departure clearance. You already did. We can restrict your financial access. Ethan smiled faintly. You accepted payment through an Earth-backed institution. I was hoping you would try that. Corinne paused. Is that a threat? It is a record. Ethan touched his wrist terminal. A small green indicator appeared. Every exchange since the ownership review began had been preserved under Terran commercial dispute rules. Tovin understood immediately. Administrator, perhaps we should continue through formal arbitration. Corinne ignored him. Curator, your department created this problem. Yes, Tovin said. The direct admission silenced everyone. My department classified the Veyari incorrectly. That does not give us permission to repeat the mistake differently. Lyra looked at him with surprise. Tovin pretended not to notice. Corinne ended the call with a promise of immediate legal action. Seconds later, the habitat doors changed from green to amber. Departure access remained restricted. Ethan checked the status. Predictable. Lyra turned toward him. You knew they would trap us here? I knew they might delay us. And you still brought us into this. Ethan faced her fully. No. The auction brought you into this long before I arrived. Lyra's expression hardened. That is convenient. It is also true. You keep saying we can choose, but every choice seems to happen inside a plan you already made. The other Veyari became still. Tovin expected Ethan to defend himself. Instead, the human nodded. Fair. Lyra blinked. Fair. You want control over what happens next. You should have it. Ethan placed his authorization card on the table and stepped away from the controls. No decisions through my account unless you approve them. Lyra studied him suspiciously. Including leaving? Including staying. Before she could answer, one of the Veyari near the western wall suddenly raised his head. Something changed. Tovin checked the environmental display. Everything is normal. Lyra turned toward the floor. The others followed at different moments. Ethan remained silent. Not the habitat, Lyra said. The station. Tovin opened the engineering network. All indicators were green. What do you sense? A rhythm that should repeat every 12 seconds. What rhythm? I do not know. Another Veyari closed her eyes. It is arriving late. Tovin checked ventilation cycles, power distribution, docking rotation, and artificial gravity timing. Nothing matched. Ethan finally spoke. Do not search for what they call it. Search for what repeats every 12 seconds. Tovin changed the query. Hundreds of station processes disappeared from the results until one remained. External navigation synchronization. His confidence vanished. That cannot be right. Lyra looked at him. Why? Because navigation synchronization is reporting normal operation. Ethan leaned toward the display. Reporting normal and being normal are not always the same thing. Tovin requested a manual comparison between 3 sensor arrays. The first reported a cargo lane clear. The second reported the same lane occupied. The third claimed both readings were valid. Tovin stared at the contradiction. Then alarms began appearing across his console. Not one dramatic failure, but dozens of small disagreements spreading through the station network. Docking computers requested verification. Environmental systems began cross-checking pressure data. Navigation control suspended automatic routing. Lyra looked around as every Veyari turned toward a different section of the station at almost the same instant. Tovin remembered the future he had mocked only hours earlier, when Ethan claimed the testing system had failed because it could not recognize what stood in front of it. Now the Grand Exchange Station was making the same mistake with itself. Its machines were functioning. Their information was not. Tovin opened the emergency channel. Engineering, confirm sensor integrity. The answer came immediately. Curator, every sensor says it is working. Ethan looked at Lyra. Lyra looked at the other 11 Veyari. Then she whispered the sentence that made Tovin stop thinking about contracts entirely. The station is losing its eyes. Nobody docks, nobody launches, and nobody trusts a green status light until we know why the station is lying to itself. Tovin Krell issued the order from the Habitat terminal while contradictory sensor reports multiplied across the Grand Exchange Station. Navigation control had already suspended automated traffic, leaving hundreds of ships safely holding positions several miles from the docking ring. Ethan Mercer remained beside Lyra Vale and the 11 other Veyari, watching information fail faster than equipment. Engineering found anything? Ethan asked. Every physical inspection says the hardware is functional, Tovin replied. Then the problem is not whether the sensors work. Lyra turned toward him. It is whether they agree. Tovin opened. Another diagnostic comparison. For navigation arrays observed the same approach corridor. Each produced a slightly different position for a stationary maintenance beacon. The differences were small, but navigation systems depended on precision. The synchronization network is drifting, Tovin said. Can you reset it? Lyra asked. We tried. The network immediately rebuilds the same disagreement. Ethan looked at the 12 Veyari. What are you sensing now? Tovin started to answer for them, but Ethan raised one hand. I asked them. The correction stung. Tovin accepted it. Lyra closed her eyes. The repeating pattern is spreading. Another Veyari pointed toward the ceiling. There are 3 rhythms now. A third shook his head. 4. Tovin transmitted their observations to engineering. An officer answered almost immediately. Curator, we have 4 synchronization clusters operating at slightly different timing references. Tovin stared at Lyra. She had identified the number without accessing a console. Can you locate the source? He asked. Lyra hesitated. Maybe. Ethan looked at her. Only if you want to. Tovin turned sharply. Mercer, the station needs them. Then ask them. This is an emergency. That does not make them equipment. The words landed harder than Tovin expected. Hours earlier, the Consortium had fought to reclaim the Veyari because they suddenly appeared valuable. Now the station itself desperately needed their ability, and Tovin had almost repeated the same mistake by assuming usefulness created obligation. He faced Lyra. Will you help us? Lyra looked at her people. No one answered immediately. Ethan did not speak for them. Tovin waited. Finally, Lyra nodded. We will help because there are people on this station who had nothing to do with what happened to us. Tovin lowered his head slightly. Thank you. Engineering opened a passive data channel. The Veyari would receive station timing patterns without being connected to any control system. Ethan insisted on that condition. They observe. Your engineers make decisions. Tovin agreed. Lyra moved to the center of the habitat. The others spread around her naturally, each choosing a different position. The violet lighting remained steady. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Lyra pointed toward one synchronization cluster. That one is following the others. An engineer responded. Cluster 3. I do not know your number. Describe it. The slowest rhythm changes after the fastest one changes. Tovin watched the data. Cluster 3 adjusted 11 seconds after Cluster 1. She is right. Another Veyari spoke. But the fastest one is not first. The engineering channel became silent. Ethan leaned forward. Explain. Something else changes before all 4. Tovin searched every visible system. There is no 5th synchronization cluster. Lyra opened her eyes. Then stopped searching the synchronization system. That sentence changed everything. Engineers widened the comparison to station infrastructure, power regulation, communications, environmental control, docking telemetry. Nothing matched until an older technician noticed a repeating correction signal from the station's central time reference. It was not failing. It was compensating. Every 12 seconds, the reference clock received a tiny external adjustment and corrected itself. Those corrections propagated differently through 4 network clusters, creating disagreements that grew with every cycle. External source identified. Engineering reported. A recently installed commercial navigation relay is transmitting an incompatible timing protocol. Tovin almost laughed from relief. Disconnected. We are isolating it now. The relay went offline. One cycle passed. Then another. The four rhythms began moving toward agreement. Lyra looked around at the others. Better. 20 seconds later, engineering confirmed it. Navigation arrays were converging. Environmental discrepancies disappeared. Docking telemetry stabilized. Tovin stared at 12 Veyari whom his department had labeled defective. They had found in minutes what thousands of station diagnostics had failed to recognize because every diagnostic kept examining its own system. Then a private message appeared from Administrator Corinne. It contained only one sentence. Secure the Veyari until Consortium representatives arrive. Tovin read it twice. Ethan noticed his expression. Problem. Tovin slowly deleted the message. Not anymore. Lyra looked at him. What did it say? Tovin turned off his Consortium authorization badge. It reminded me that some systems take longer to correct than others. You save their station, and their first response is to decide who owns you. Ethan Mercer said it quietly, but Tovin Krell could not pretend the words were unfair. The Grand Exchange Station had stabilized. Navigation arrays agreed again. Docking telemetry had returned to normal, and hundreds of waiting ships were receiving safe traffic instructions. Yet before the final diagnostic report was complete, Administrator Vel Corinne appeared on every priority channel demanding immediate Consortium custody of the 12 Veyari. Lyra Vale stood beside the other 11 under the habitat's violet light. He wants us secured? Tovin nodded. Until representatives arrive. For our protection? Ethan asked. Tovin looked at him. That is the phrase they are using. Ethan gave a humorless smile. Convenient. A new transmission opened. Corinne appeared with 2 legal officers. Curator Krell, restore your authorization and lock Habitat 7. Tovin remained still. No, Corinne stared at him. Repeat that. The Veyari voluntarily assisted during a station emergency. They are not equipment requiring containment. Your opinion is irrelevant. Yesterday you trusted my opinion enough to classify them as defective. Silence followed. Lyra looked at Tovin with something approaching respect. Corinne shifted his attention toward Ethan. Mr. Mercer, the Consortium is prepared to increase its offer to 25 times your purchase price. Ethan leaned against the control table. Ask Lyra. Corinne frowned. You hold the transaction record. Ask Lyra. This is a commercial negotiation. Ethan's voice remained calm. Not anymore. Corinne finally looked toward her. Would your group accept a compensated research arrangement under Consortium supervision? Lyra glanced at the 11 Veyari. Their attention moved through the room with the subtle coordination that everyone had once mistaken for impairment. No, Corinne's expression tightened. You should consider the benefits before answering. I did. You may never receive another offer of this magnitude. Lyra almost smiled. Yesterday nobody offered anything. Ethan said nothing. He did not need to. The humiliation belonged entirely to the people who had created it. Corinne tried another approach. Your abilities could transform navigation, exploration, and emergency response throughout civilized space. Maybe, Lyra replied. Then cooperation is logical. Cooperation requires a choice. Tovin watched Corinne struggle with a concept the Consortium normally buried beneath contracts. Administrator, Tovin said, their independent status reviews are still processing. Corinne's eyes narrowed. Those reviews will be challenged. Ethan touched his wrist terminal. Already handled. Tovin turned toward him. What did you do? Nothing dramatic. That sentence has become suspicious whenever you say it. Ethan opened a Terran legal confirmation. The 12 autonomy petitions had been mirrored through an independent interstellar arbitration service the moment station access was restricted. The Consortium could contest them, but it could no longer quietly erase them. Corinne read the confirmation and went silent. Lyra looked at Ethan. You filed that before the station problem. Yes. Before you knew we could help anyone. Yes. Something changed in her expression. Until that moment, a small part of her had still wondered whether Ethan's kindness depended on discovering their usefulness. Now she had the answer. He had protected their right to choose while the galaxy still considered them worthless. Corinne ended the transmission without another offer. Tovin exhaled. You realize this is going to become a political disaster. Ethan looked around the habitat. Only for people who insist on making it one. A station engineer suddenly appeared on the public channel. Curator, we have completed the incident review. Navigation control requests permission to enter the Veyari observations into the official record. Tovin looked toward Lyra. This time he remembered. Do you consent? Lyra exchanged glances with her people. Yes. But list all 12 of us as independent contributors. Done. Minutes later, the report went public across the station. The response was immediate. Messages arrived from universities, rescue organizations, exploration crews, and Veyari communities across several systems. Not purchase offers. Questions. Invitations. Requests to understand what had been forgotten. Lyra stared at the growing list. Our people are asking how we did it. Ethan shook his head. Wrong question. What should they ask? He looked at the 12 Veyari standing together. What changed that made you forget you could? Tovin felt the weight of that question. The Consortium had spent generations perfecting tests that isolated variables. Veyari society had spent generations adapting to those standards. Somewhere along the way, an entire species had learned to interpret disconnection as deficiency. Lyra turned toward Ethan. You knew we were not defective. I suspected. And if you had been wrong? Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You still would not have deserved that label deciding the rest of your life. For once, Lyra had no immediate reply. Then another notification appeared. The Independent Arbitration Service had reached a preliminary decision on all 12 autonomy petitions. Tovin opened the result, read the first sentence, and slowly smiled. Mercer. Ethan looked over. What? Tovin turned the display toward Lyra instead. I think this belongs to her. It says we belong to ourselves. Lyra Vale read the arbitration decision twice before saying the words aloud, as though 9 simple syllables required more trust than anything she had sensed that day. Around her, the other 11 Veyari moved closer to the display. Ethan Mercer remained several feet away. He did not reach for the terminal. He did not explain the ruling. He simply waited while Lyra continued reading. The preliminary decision recognized all 12 as independent sapient persons under the autonomy provisions activated through Ethan's Terran transaction, immediately suspending every commercial control clause attached to their auction records. Tovin Krell released a slow breath. The Consortium can appeal. Lyra looked at him. Can they reverse our status while they appeal? No, for the first time since Tovin had met her. Lyra smiled without caution. Then the habitat doors changed from amber to green. Departure restriction removed. Ethan picked up his jacket. Looks like you can leave whenever you want. Lyra stared at him. Just like that. That is usually how doors work. Tovin almost laughed. Lyra did not. I mean us. Ethan stopped. What about you? You spent a fortune. Yes. You challenged the Consortium. Apparently. You arranged legal protection before you knew whether our ability had any value. Ethan nodded. Lyra stepped closer. Why? Ethan looked toward the original auction receipt still archived on the wall terminal. Because everyone in that room was asking the wrong question. Tovin folded his arms. Which question? What are they worth? Ethan said, I wanted to know why 12 healthy people had been given the same defective classification. Lyra glanced toward the receipt. So you bought us because you thought the auction house made a mistake. Partly. And the other part? Ethan opened another document. Tovin recognized the timestamp immediately. It had been created 11 seconds after the auction transaction completed. The purchaser field listed Ethan Mercer. The beneficiary field did not. It listed an independent trust established for the 12 Veyari, with authority transferring to them upon recognition of autonomous legal status. Lyra stared at the document. You created this before we left the auction hall. Yes. Before changing the light. Yes. Before seeing what we could do. Yes. Tovin finally understood the entire transaction. Ethan had never intended to keep ownership. He had used the auction's own rules to move the Veyari out of a system that required somebody to purchase their contracts, then created a legal bridge towards self-control before anyone knew they possessed an extraordinary ability. Lyra looked almost angry again, but this time emotion made her voice unsteady. Then what exactly did you buy? Ethan considered the question. Time. Time for what? For somebody to look at you without that red label. Deciding what they saw. Silence filled the habitat. Tovin looked away first. During his career, he had evaluated thousands of individuals through measurements, categories, and market classifications. Ethan had entered the same room and noticed the one variable no instrument recorded. Everyone had already decided what Lot 17 was before the bidding began. Over the next 2 days, everything changed. The Consortium formally withdrew its custody request after public scrutiny made the position impossible to defend. Veyari medical institutions requested the original assessment data. Universities offered cooperative studies requiring voluntary participation. Rescue organizations asked whether Veyari sensory coordination could someday improve emergency detection. Lyra accepted none of the offers immediately. Ethan approved of that. "You can take your time," he told her. "Nobody gets to rush you because they finally noticed you." Tovin submitted his own report before Ethan departed. He removed the word defective from all 12 records permanently and requested a galaxy-wide review of evaluation protocols involving communal species. Months later, that recommendation became policy. Years later, Veyari communities began restoring environmental practices their ancestors had abandoned generations earlier. Their collective awareness did not make them magical or perfect. It simply made them themselves again. Tovin eventually became famous for the report that changed interspecies evaluation standards, although he never accepted much credit for it. Whenever someone asked what inspired the reform, he told them about a quiet human who walked into an auction where experts saw 12 worthless contracts and spent an absurd amount of money without explaining why. Most listeners assumed Ethan Mercer had recognized a valuable biological capability before everyone else. Tovin always corrected them. That was not the remarkable part. The remarkable part was that Ethan had protected the Veyari before knowing they were valuable at all. The galaxy thought the human had discovered hidden treasure. Tovin knew better. Ethan Mercer had simply recognized people in a room where everyone else had been trained to see inventory.